to hand over to MAS, our student society, who have organised this event. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it.
Hello everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Joanna, and with Sam, we are running MAS this year. And the theme of the year is left on the drawing board.
This year's theme we worked out amongst ourselves and with our tutors about projects that have been thought about in practice, they've been worked through, design ideas have been evolved, but the project has never necessarily realised itself. And we thought that that was actually sometimes some of the richest ideas and the richest thought go into things that a lot of us in this room may or may not have ever seen. And so we've asked our tutors, which we'd obviously like to thank for giving talks so far, and we've also asked William Mann from Witherford Watson Mann to give a lecture this evening on unbuilt work. Before I hand over to William, I'm just going to pass over to Matthew Barrett from Cube, who is co-hosting this with us. So I'll hand over to him, and then without further ado, we'll pass over to William.
Thanks very much. My name is Matthew Barrett. I'm a professor of architecture and urban culture here. I want to welcome everybody, and for my opening remarks, I've got 2 points. The first is just a brief note about our research centre, which is called Cube, and the second is to say a few notes about William Mann, my keynote speaker. I can see lots of people still coming in. There's lots of seats at the front over here if you are starting to see what to say. So Cube is our research centre here at the school. It stands for the acronym CUBE, C-U-B-E, stands for Centre of Urban and Built Ecologies. We at Cube are very happy to have been collaborating with MAS this year. MAS, for those of you who don't know, is the Metropolitan Architecture Student Society. And this is in fact our 3rd event. The first event was a film screening for a film titled The Art of Architecture, which was commissioned by Eric Parry Architects and made by the Oscar-winning documentary maker John Blair. And we had a fantastic event here with about this many in the audience. And we were really happy to have involvement with MAS to produce that. And also we had a Q&A at the end of it with MAS represented as the student voice on that panel. The second event was in November last year, where we had Kevin Kimweli, who's a cutting-edge architect from Nairobi in Kenya, as part of the UK-Kenya season 2025. And MAS also collaborated with us on that, and it was a great event. Cube, about Cube, it's really the home. The research centre is the home for our research community in architecture, urbanism, interior design, design systems, and anything to do with spaces and places. And we run a series of events throughout the year, as well as convening the projects that our research groups do. And part of that is collaboration with external sponsors and industry, and hence the Eric Parry event as well that we have an ongoing series of events, and we hope to also collaborate again with MAS later in the year. So do keep your eyes peeled and look at the events on our website. Okay, that's the hard sell for Cube. William, I'm going to age us, but William and I go back a long way. We, in fact, celebrated our 40-year reunion last year with our first-year architecture students at Cambridge, where we started back in the 80s. It's quite wonderful how in the world of architecture you can continue a conversation for a really long period of time involving your students and new colleagues and so on, and also even your classmates dating back so long. So it's great to have you here. Back on a more formal note, I have some biographical details to mention. William studied architecture at the University of Cambridge and at Harvard University. He worked on archaeological sites in Rome and Egypt, and then gained professional experience at Tim Ronalds in London and Robrecht and Dam in Flanders. He established Witherford Watson Mann, in fact also with classmates, and they have a broad and critically acclaimed practice with a range of built and published projects, including not one but 2 Sterling Prize winners. This year, Appleby Blue, which many of you will be familiar with, and in fact in 2013, I think it was, for Astley Castle. Sorry, not this year, last year for Appleby Blue, and in 2013 for Astley Castle, which was a extraordinary renovation reinterpretation scheme, and of course Appleby Blue, for those of you who don't know it, is sheltered housing. William is also a published author and architectural scholar who has written on London's edge landscapes, social engineering, self-build, and many other topics, and he was visiting professor at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen in 2014. I'm going to hand over to you. I believe the microphone here is.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you all for the invitation. Oh yes, good. The narrative arc of my talk this evening is slightly sugary. It's about arriving at a kind of positive outcome despite unpromising conditions, many obstacles, distilling work by persistence and patience. So I apologise in advance if my optimism seems excessive. But, you know, after all, we're service providers and we're paid to be optimists by the square metre. But before we get to the sugar, I'll start with the vinegar. And there's quite a lot of that. And even I'll start with the time before the vinegar, when it seemed that we were making wine. And beneath the volatile chemistry of emotions, and I suppose maybe now's not a terrible moment in our practice trajectory to talk about failure, about the unbuilt, the half-built, the lost. My theme really is how we imagine the city. We, myself and my colleagues, we, our profession, and we as a society, and how we might imagine it differently. Through careful observation of at the smallest and largest scales, by anchoring our imagination in the specific potential of place. A potential that's shaped by historically accumulated characteristics, which we need to be quite attentive to read. It's potential we can unlock through localised and associative memory, and that we can realise, above all, by finding allies who also value this potential. So I take my title from a short speech that Álvaro Siza gave on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of the Cooperativa Boa Vontade in Malagueira, Évora. I changed it slightly to avoid disappointing anyone who would like to hear my thoughts about Birmingham. So the second city, the other city here, I think is a little bit more Italo-Calvino and a bit less West Midlands conurbation. Caesar said, inside each city there's a second city, unreal, imaginary, made up of demolished houses and demolished projects, which are nonetheless still present. The majority of the architect's work has to do with this second city, and this work is never wasted. Well, for me and my colleagues, our second city, our other city, is in many ways mapped on London, the city we live and work in. And quite a lot of those unbuilt, part-built and lost projects, which I'll talk about this evening, are in the southeast quadrant of the city, a part of the city built and rebuilt many times. To start with a bit of context, when Stephen, Chris and I first arrived in London in the late 80s, there was no citywide government. There was not yet a London plan, so public transport was poor, but there weren't opportunity areas for development at all costs. The progressive but flawed County of London plan had ground to a halt, substantially delivered but still unfinished. And obviously that was a kind of modernist city of sorts. It was a attempt to turn London into a garden city of sorts as well, ringed by garden suburbs, carving parks out of bomb sites. And so in a way, that kind of vision, that optimistic progressive vision of the County of London plan was overlaid on the destruction that enabled the vision. which remains visible in the corners beneath the surface. This is the LCC bomb damage maps. So it remains in the memory and conditions of particular places. And also, as did the poverty, whose symptoms the plan sought to address. Again, this is in the Booth poverty map from the 1890s. So all of those remained. And then the modernist housing estates had lost any aura of newness that they might once have had. The large post-war parks were unfinished with sparse and immature planting. The city felt engagingly loose, unvarnished and unfinished, a bit dodgy. Its incompletion, its broken character felt like an opportunity, felt like an invitation. There was a Hawksmoor church still in ruins of the war. There were grand crumbling industrial buildings, vacant and sparsely occupied sites around the edges of the centre, vast areas of railway sidings and goods yards lying open and inactive. And it was hard to read the boundaries between bombs, bulldozers and ongoing processes of change. They were side by side, entangled with each other, bound together with an outgrowth of Baudelaire. There was no positive strategy of change, but there was no false prospectus. Indeed, as Patrick Keeler put it rather acerbically, the subjective transformation of landscape seems to offer the individual a way to oppose the poverty of everyday surroundings. As individuals, we can't rebuild the public transport system or re-empower local democracy, but we can poeticize our relationship with their dilapidation. A few corners of the city spoke to us. They offered a glimpse of another city that could have emerged more fully from the rubble of World War II, a pointer even to a different city. The Spa Green Estate by Lebetkin and Tecton, a constrained and restrained fragment of modernist city in creative tension with its older surroundings. Its three buildings seem to slip their moorings on the street, leading off from the adjacent Victorian terrace houses into the depth of the site, between park and courtyard. At Golden Lane, the apartment blocks loosely define a series of linked courtyards, weaving in a sports centre with a swimming pool and sunken tennis courts. The sophisticated urban modernism was perhaps informed by Lebetkin, Christophe Bon of Chamberlain, Powell and Bon's work in Paris and Milan, or their native Tbilisi and Zurich. Certainly had something other than London. They shaped engaging pockets of collective life among the streets and one-family houses, not instead of, but as well as. We recognise a similar spirit and sense of possibility in works by Hans Kohlhoff and Alvaro Siza in the deep urban blocks of Berlin, which aren't defined just by the back-to-back or the kind of house, couple of rooms, small back garden, then mirror and repeat. And these sort of bold carvings, these openings up of semi-public territories on the interior of blocks made an impression. For the spaces in between, the self-seeded landscape of industrial estates, the herb gardens and allotments carved out of undefined open space, the guerrilla gardens and the streets between the former squats at Bonington Square, these sketched richer possibilities. And this was the memory bank and the glimmerings of an urban imaginary that we brought to our second project together for the 2000 Europan competition in Peckham, where we encountered a clash of approaches to housing, the 1960s estates of North Peckham that lined Abercrombie's Burgess Park, which had replaced 19th century terraces. The slab blocks, walkways and open parkland were then broken up, built on, torn down, replaced by terraces to houses, front doors on streets, private gardens. And caught between these two models were the emerging ideas for the new public spaces. Kind of quasi-town square, public facilities like a swimming pool and a library. The site was to the west of the new square, behind the swimming pool, I think that might well be it. And then with the library beyond. It was fragmented, had different sorts of edges. It's an awkward shape with the curve of the high street being met by a small street. There was a fragment of 19th century terrace, the large new swimming pool, a Victorian school building now used for workshops and businesses. Our design began as a perimeter block, then became more broken, absorbing forces and pushing and pulled from all sides, pushed out to the high street line, back from the school building, pushed forward towards the square, eased back to bring in the tram, built to 5 stories on the north side and set down to 2 stories on the south to bring in more sunlight. We used these contortions of the building to make 3 public spaces, 2 external and 1 internal, creating a shared but porous interior landscape. With shared allotment gardens in the courtyard in that V. Don't know if I can point. Do you see the mouse? Yeah. So shared allotment gardens, a 5-a-side pitch, and then a sports and arts venue. So quite sort of, we had a bit of professional experience, but we still had that kind of anything's possible kind of spirit. Hadn't yet been knocked out of us. So this idea that it wasn't an object, it was a gathering together of surviving fragments of a rich history. It wasn't systematic or mechanical, but it sort of flexed to grow out and respond to these different edges and pressures. And we sort of explored this idea of a little, this was before London was, towers per 10 a penny, and this sort of 8-story tower or something felt rather bold and interesting sort of marker. We proposed housing with a single horizontal walkway at 2nd floor level, on top of maisonettes below, accessing a combination of apartments and maisonettes above. Imagining this walkway as a kind of generous glazed balcony, looking over the gardens and the planted roofs of the public spaces. And we tried to think into and represent what it would be like to live there. Small households in sociable proximity, idea of kind of key workers and students, and overlooking the patchwork of collective spaces, being close to the high street. And what we wrote probably still just about holds. That Peckham, like South London in general, has a disjointed feel, a village crossroads overrun by a tide of bricks, villas, terraces, factories, viaducts, first filling the fields, then receding, as bombs, parks, redevelopment, closures leave more and more gaps. The place now has a feel of uncertainty, but also of possibility. We wanted to catch this mix of openness and definition to make a piece of city where neither spaces nor objects dominate, but where diverse situations, a sports hall, civic rooms, a nursery, flats, cafes and offices, allotments, winter gardens, a tram stop, sit side by side, where boundaries are loosely enough drawn to encourage appropriation, but are still clear enough to deter abuse. We won the competition and decided to set up an office to help deliver the project. But of course the tram didn't happen, and the tram was the vehicle. This was the Camden to Peckham tram, mooted by the Cross River Partnership, who had no power to deliver a transport project. The downside of not having a mayor or a London government. So the borough couldn't buy the streetfront properties, and the project didn't happen, or it didn't happen for a long time. I think they just finished this last year, this housing, a long wait with, slightly diminished ambition. Perhaps as some kind of consolation prize, we were commissioned by the Peckham Partnership to prepare an open space framework, which kind of responded to, you can see here, Burgess Park, that large space kind of carved out along the old Surrey Canal as part of the Abercrombie plan. And then those sort of dense, system-built North Peckham estates in the process of being torn down and rebuilt. Building on the open spaces to decant, cutting down all the mature trees. So it's a very strange landscape, and ending up with this linear canal park, and these other sort of pockets and patches of open space without much sense of coherence. So we tried to develop a sense of a kind of distinctive series of multifunctional spaces that used the characteristics, but in a way had a kind of binding quality in the area, offering a conjunction of necessary facilities, enabling, among other things, sociability and mutual support. This was an idea, all the blocks had communal laundries and various other bits of communal infrastructure. So as those were torn down, the shared spaces were torn down. So this was an idea of a kind of synergy. And I think Photoshop did exist in these days, but we just deliberately chose not to use it and to sort of draw and use scissors. As just an idea, to explore this idea of a laundry and cafe with a kids' playground in front, with, I suppose, this idea of being able to care for your kids, for other people's kids, have that kind of secure playground in front of you, have that sort of qualitative landscape where you could just pass a bit of time and, wash your smalls, replacing, I suppose, just with the washing machine almost then as this sort of emblem of the private consumer good, that there's no reason for it not to be collective. The project happened. We were invited to tender for it. There was a very, very fishy process, which I still don't understand to this day, but our tender was wrongly computed and added up. So it looked like we were much more expensive than another team, and this is what they built with its qualities, but certainly a very different vision. You'd have thought sort of once bitten, twice shy, or even twice bitten, thrice shy, but not a bit of it. So when Europan relaunched, I suppose we thought the briefs are ambitious, there's an idea of the city in it, the judging is sort of serious. Neve Brown was Sarah Wigglesworth was on the judging panel for the Peckham one, and there was a fellow whose name I forget from Atelier 5 who was on the judging panel for this. So there was a kind of international perspective to it that was attractive. And this was in Stonebridge in northwest London. I think 2005, there was another estate regeneration project where they were, this is what the government were doing in the late 90s, early 2000s, this idea of sink estates and, buildings being part of the problem. And I suppose when you're sharing a front door with 200 other people, I can see there sort of is an issue. But they took this is massively subsidised. This is in a way, like many other things, a process that started with the best of intentions to address some pretty challenging environments with a massive public subsidy to sort of tear them down and redevelop them in a more manageable and managed form. So we won the initial competition with the terrace and maisonettes on the left, this sort of sloping park terraced into a series of sports pitches and other elements, and then apartment blocks on the right with a link down to the main street. But then they changed the site to a more complex one, fair enough, with a canal running through it. It's a feeder canal to the Grand Union Canal, just to keep the water levels topped up. So we developed a design around a central garden, part public, part for residents, with there's a 19th century hotel building on the bottom right. We proposed 4-storey apartments and maisonettes on that south face, facing the street and a park. 6-storey apartments on top of a half-sunken small car park. A 9-storey tower, marking them with this sort of semi-public garden on the interior, with a public street running through as a kind of connection between these two previously largely disconnected parts of the estate. Giving the garden a kind of public dimension and opening this kind of landscape up to an everyday public usage. We got planning consent for 122 apartments in 2007, so I suppose that was a sort of something we could say we'd done. And then, of course, it was a 2008 financial crisis, kind of certainly put a brake on things. And I'm not really quite sure what happened, but when they resumed building activity, because this was programmed, it was funded, it was estate regeneration, they retendered it, and another architect won the job to build the project. None of us had really had the heart to go back, but apparently this is what it looks like. This is Elephant and Castle, probably already about 15 years ago or more. Kind of heart of modernist South London. It's already quite different now, but you can see it was starting to shift and change. It was a Victorian crossroads, actually, with theatres and pubs. It was the Piccadilly Circus of South London, or possibly London's Alexanderplatz. It was a kind of working class but dynamic kind of focus of pleasure and leisure. That was the Metropolitan Tabernacle on the right-hand side, a 3,000-seat non-conformist church from the time. So I suppose it's this sort of thing of, struggle of drinkers and teetotalers embodied in the city, and of course heavily bombed. But the Metropolitan Tabernacle refused to move, so they couldn't do their comprehensive scheme. It was a key node in Abercrombie's road system. I think it's X marks the spot, where the idea of a kind of major crossroad and then forking out in between inner ring and outer ring would all intersect. And obviously it was quite a bit less neat than that, because I suppose it was this sort of a modernisation of probably a network of medieval lanes. Goldfinger led the planning. This is then his Alexander Fleming House on the right, with these glimmers then of high-tech or Pompidou Centre advertising within a kind of rationalist framework, and then these slightly constructivist photomurals of nurses for the Department of Health's offices. So a kind of an optimistic vision. And then Rodney Gordon's Faraday Memorial, which houses the transformers for the Bakerloo line. Faraday was local, and it's got this sort of sheen of the future. Beautiful thing with this sort of, you don't see it so well now that the transformers and the cladding's there, but this sort of pinwheel structure, certain sort of static dynamism that's rather kind of clever and elegant, and then these stainless steel panels with these sort of lenses in them that just sort of catch the light in a certain way. But obviously after a certain time, this sort of glimmer of the future, the imagined future, takes a patina and starts to look sort of dirty and old, and there were sort of various visions came forward in the early 2000s, probably before the mayor, but starting to sort of unlock and tap into a sort of sense of ambition and potential again. You know, now this sort of tower scheme is 10 a penny, but I think it was a kind of sense of, you know, we'll put this place on the map. Of course, the outcome of that was then the demolition of the Haygate estate. This sort of, and I suppose this is then where the thing of estate renewal of so-called sink estates and areas with entrenched social problems started to shade, and over the decades started to shade into a expropriation. I mean, I think it's in the 30-year period. In the 30-year period, been something like 300,000 affordable homes built under the mayor, and maybe a few of the years preceding the mayor. But and in that same period, 300,000 homes have been lost from the social housing sector through right to buy, as well as, of course, this process of clearance. So these sort of, and I guess that's what I mean about the the wine turning into vinegar. These sort of, nobody sets out with haven't met anyone who sets out with a kind of ambition for social cleansing or massive social impacts. But there's I think there's a sense in which once we put a vision or a dream out there as architects, we're sort of responsible for it, but other people take it on and take it places we're maybe not comfortable with, and I think that's an awkward and difficult area. There was, strangely, for this area that was dominated by traffic, where the Abercrombie plan said no theatres or places of entertainment, despite that being what it had been previously, because of the traffic. Street life, market persisted. The shopping centre had all sorts of issues, probably. I forget what phase of its lengthy regeneration it's in, but then there's a Latin American market moved down from Seven Sisters Road to the Elephant and Castle. So the void, the possibility, this sort of vacancy was quickly filled and energised. And in a way that certainly seemed like it could be supported without knocking lots of things down, but with some more targeted and focused works. We kind of worked with, and we were intrigued by this sort of modernist idea of multiple horizons. This is Le Corbusier's Cité de Refuge on the right-hand side, and then this is, I think it's St George's Church in Sofia on the left. So this idea of almost a sort of ground being below you, and then you've got the pavement level, and then you've got this sort of social spaces in small pavilions, and then you've got this kind of these sort of slabs making large external rooms with then, certainly in the case of Corb, these sort of penthouses on top, enjoying and marking the skyline of the city. We traced the overlay of the Victorian crossroads, which had been, I suppose you sort of see then here, this is in the Bakerloo line station in a kind of corner apartment building. That's the Metropolitan Tabernacle. The kind of modernist structure with, in a way, then the key sort of thing here being Alexander Fleming House, the Goldfinger, Paranet House, also modernist structure, the London College of Communications. So 3 large buildings, including then the small pavilion, the Faraday Pavilion, all in this sort of same orthogonal orientation, with then this sort of strange, crazy sort of medieval lane structure meets highway design. And we were appointed to really design the public realm for what they called a peninsularisation scheme. They've just done one at Old Street, so where they attach the roundabout to one side and make it two-way working. And I suppose our brief was largely to do paving and benches and planting for this remnant pieces of public realm around these crossings. With, of course, then there were subways. We had a Save the Subways campaign, but anyway, levelled and then just actually being able to cross at street level. So in that sense, it's sort of micro design, very modest, but making some small differences. But we were kind of pushed and challenged to, I suppose, a level of ambition, partly by the development partners, and came up then with this idea of something that was a kind of bastard version of a London Square, which they don't really have. There aren't many of those in south of the river, but and they're all over Mayfair and Fitzrovia. But this idea of a kind of large external room with these sort of multiple horizons, many of them inherited from the modernist period, with then potentially new towers, the shopping centre with this idea of a kind of internal street continuing the old street line, the Bakerloo line building, the Faraday Memorial, and then the idea that you could have other pavilions inhabiting that space that would mark the old street lines. That in a way this would be fragments bound in a simple rectilinear outdoor room, which of course would have required certain landowners in due course, when they redeveloped their sites, to sacrifice a small amount of land or to buy into a kind of a collective vision, which for a while it seemed like they did and would. And that offered a kind of possibility of, like I say, yes, this sort of bastard London Square with a market canopy, with the Bakerloo line station, with the Faraday Memorial as pavilions, garden pavilions within the overall thing, with the market canopy next to the Faraday Memorial, and kind of Nelson's column with an elephant on top, marking this sort of pivot. And this idea of, I suppose, the modernism somehow compatible with the and reconciled, and obviously that's then the old street line you see looking down. That I suppose the multi-level city was one of the dogmas of modernism, but there's other ways of doing that, and even we felt there was a kind of possibility to sort of somehow take all these fragments, take all these broken bits, the broken bits of the future, and the future's past, and meld them into something that still had a kind of coherence, and above all had a generosity that suited a growing population, a growing residential population, a growing population of people passing through. So that was the externally sourced CGI for the path for the kind of positive thing. This was the image we created, which was a little bit more Alexanderplatz, binding these older pasts and these projected and half-baked or half-realised futures into a simple logic, with a kind of experiential richness and this sort of sense of reconciling the layers of the city. Whatever consensus there was didn't hold very long, and so we got as far as realising a few areas of paving and planting. I have to say, just being able to cross that level, the kind of this relation to the Faraday Memorial as the kind of pivot and the centre of this space is actually quite special, but obviously that very much is a kind of part realised design. So kind of tantalising sense of something that was, I would hope, realistically ambitious, but just sort of pushing at the possibilities, certainly within a developer-led culture. And I suppose the Elephant and Castle, like a number of places, is, you could call it a palimpsest if you're charitable, or a graveyard of half-built projections. Goldfinger didn't get to do what he was going to do, what he wanted to do. The kind of visions of the early 2000s. We did a piece of it, someone else will have another bite, and probably that won't be fully realised. So I suppose in this sense, you start to kind of, I mean, obviously our world and our profession are becoming saturated with these images that, you know, didn't exist when we were studying, and didn't even exist when we started practicing, of where now you have to label it to sort of so that people can tell that it's not a photograph. But there is a sense, I do have a sense of the city being contested in these sort of paper imaginings, and I wish I could find stronger words and motivations for our take on it, because I suppose there's the kind of the premise of so many regeneration, redevelopment schemes seems to me to be almost a modernism light. Modernism without the social ambition, but with the kind of the hints of openness and publicness and flowing mobility and green. And I suppose it's just trying to understand what the that sort of dirtier, more down-to-earth side is, where actually the remnants of the old city are still valued and possibly even kind of elevated in value. The public realm work at Elephant and Castle was a pendant, a kind of follow-on from actually an earlier study we did in Bankside. It's sort of a pendant in time and a pendant in space. They're down at the south of the Bankside area, from a very different kind of sort of city, which seemed even sort of formless and kind of certainly had a complex order. And again, this was a public realm framework that we, I think, started working on in 2006, 2007. It was associated with Tate Modern's Tate Modern 2, building on a public park, and therefore needing some wider vision of public space. Within this area that was an accumulation of a kind of medieval structure along Borough High Street, the rectilinear Georgian structure of Blackfriars Road, the then riverfront redevelopment from the 80s and onwards. And we traced its metamorphosis from this sort of the road into London, marshland colonised and subdivided around a set of lanes. So this is from traced from John Rock's map from the 1740s, and you sort of see probably even drainage ditches and lanes and the like, colouring and directing the structure, which of course those lanes are still very much there. Overlaid with, carved this sort of long straight street and the bridge, Blackfriars Bridge, and of course then this little correction just off the map where it meets St George's Circus and then tacks on to Elephant and Castle. Early Victorian bridge, Southwark Bridge, then this whole sort of suite of railway viaducts that just sort of ran rampant through London, particularly in the sort of poorer parts, displacing people, carving through, and I think sort of Parliament debated these things, and each time by the time it sort of sounds a bit like tech regulation, the very good Jerry White book, London the 19th Century, every time they sort of reached a resolution about what to do about railways, the goalposts have moved and they sort of knocked down 15 more streets and carved new viaducts. The bomb damage, you can see that actually quite a lot of it clustered. Obviously then Bankside Power Station was post World War II, already a sort of large area of clearance, and then extensions, more viaducts, more kind of renewal. So just it's kind of quite striking and shocking. I suppose there's this sort of thing of working at scale in the city where your power, your influence is infinitely diluted, but your learning and your receptiveness, your ability to actually understand and somehow perhaps internalize these processes seems like it may be heightened. We identified a series of kind of pockets of vitality and sociability, kind of social and creative exchange, scattered across the area. It's very sort of stratified. It felt like the kind of riverfront, particularly the viaducts, created a barrier that these natural connections of the old medieval lanes were sort of being blocked and frustrated, and that there were significant kind of barriers to movement and communication. So we parsed this into, in a manner of a forest, into rides, clearings and streams as a sort of way of conceptualizing an urban order that isn't a conventional planned order, and is in fact a kind of a palimpsest or an overlay of a whole series of interventions. We imagined and we projected that out of a sort of focused series of interventions, a more cohesive and open character could be nurtured through a combination of biodiversity measures, public art, places of social and creative exchange, kind of building up the cohesion of this area. In a way, I mean, there's an element of I suppose celebration with modest correction of the existing city. I think it's Patrick Geddes who talked about gentle surgery or conservative surgery, which he practiced in Edinburgh, also a number of interesting city plans in India, which was absolutely opposite of this idea of tabula rasa, tearing things down. And maybe there's a lot of, in this, visual kind of rhetoric that are supposed to kind of nurture and encourage thoughtful design, that with possibly some quite focused and limited opportunities that, I suppose the proposition really is that if you network the open spaces, they don't have to be massive, they don't have to be generic, they can actually be tailored to the specific constraints and characteristics of the space. This was an idea of a kind of forest grove of pine trees in front of the on the south side of Tate Modern, with then large-scale artworks sort of woven through. So I suppose an idea of this is, I think, borrowed from the Sacro Bosco in Bermazzo. So I suppose an idea of a strange, almost sort of enchanted or estranged landscape within the city. The idea of opening up the railway arches as a series of kind of workshops and creative spaces, and then here at the intersection of Southwark Bridge Road and Union Street, the old public toilets, already in use as a cafe, but which then reimagined as a woodland cabin with the existing plane trees sort of wrapped in to the body of the building with a expanded canopy. So this is Flatiron Square as we delivered it. I forget even how long ago that was. It's probably about 15 years ago or 13 years ago or something. But pedestrianising one side with a cycle route through, reusing actually a lot of the paving, laying it. So the combination of concrete pavers and reclaimed York stone. This is a laminated oak canopy with an intense, rather abundant green roof on top of it. And I suppose what's interesting with this is it had at the time, and I think that has sort of largely endured, it had a catalytic effect. And I suppose that catalytic effect probably came down to the fact that this was actually fine-grained ownership. There isn't a single developer. It's just actually a series of individual small plots and small buildings which are operated opportunistically with a bit of creativity. But even then, what came out of this was the cafe at the time, and it's changed hands a number of times. But you know, cafes and bars, restaurants. I mean, I think I'll stick to architecture because that looks like really hard work and really sort of high turnover. But what happened at the time was this, like I say, this catalytic effect where the people operating the cafe they did children's parties, poetry book launch. There was the sense that this kind of slightly romantic and random, strange take on layering something onto the existing city structure with some quite gentle and focused works unlocked a sense of opportunity and appropriation. It wasn't all unbuilt, so to the canopy. And throughout these years we did manage to build some housing. In fact, on the basis of the Peckham Europan scheme with the Flemish Government Architects open call, we won this housing project in Gistel in West Flanders, quite close to Ostend. The 13 apartments took us 12 years, including 5 on site with I don't remember which particular financial crisis that was, but some bankruptcies and this and that. So yeah, it wasn't exactly speed and scale, but it was housing for older people. These 2 women in the picture are sisters. So it was originally meant to be all for older people, but then we had to leave out the lift for financial reasons. And so the upper units are then younger single parent families, younger people. So it's an interestingly mixed community. It folds and bends, and it's a crazy project because it's got an external corner, it's got an internal corner, really difficult to plan, which is, I suppose, the idea of forming and shaping an urban space. So this 17th century inn, which then became a cafe, it's got ground floor units, it's got roof level units, it's got all the non-repeating parts, and all you need, if you extrude a few bits, actually it would make a little bit of sense. But you know, for 3.5% fee over a 12-year period, it doesn't even bear thinking out about. But it was a interesting and kind of powerful learning curve, and certainly something that. And then this is then the housing we built for postgraduate researchers in northwest Cambridge, and with again this sort of internal semi-public garden, access through a kind of cut in the corner, again gallery access housing. So we use these projects as ways to explore and develop and try to hold on some kind of idea or some kind of ambition of a city. Of course, there's this sort of idea in Cambridge, actually, the idea was that it was a master plan based on perimeter blocks, and yet the budget was based on linear extrusions. And it's like, how do you reconcile this? And we ended up with this pokey little corner with 27 apartments wrapped around it, and then a sewer running through. I think actually we encouraged them to run the sewer there so that we could take a public footpath through, making this sort of landscape more porous and permeable. So, which sort of leads me to transgress the nature of the invitation and talk about a built project after this sort of lengthy process of skirmishes with South London, skirmishes with its mixed character, through indirect contacts from the as a result of the Bankside Open Spaces study. So I suppose there are also genealogies between these projects. Some of it's testing ideas. You know, it feels like quite a few idées fixes just sort of explored and explored. And I don't know if you get to build them, then maybe you just get that out of the system and then move on and do something different. But it feels to me like this is something that's closer to our souls than that, and that in a way what we're trying to struggle for is some kind of idea for the city and of collectivity in the city. United St Saviour's approached us about a new almshouse in Bermondsey on Southwark Park Road. That the double monopitch building, that was an abandoned nursing home that was squatted and that was a council property. The United St Saviour's were created at the dissolution of the monasteries, and they took over some of the monastic social work, including housing for the poor, with some almshouses. And we'd learned enough about building social housing to give them some basic reassurances. The almshouse, which is pictured bottom right on the site hoarding, is the off-site social housing component of Triptych, which is a private residential development next to Tate Modern. So in that sense, these things sort of, the Bankside area, its vertical kind of growth, all feels like it's somehow, although they're 2 miles apart, there's still this sense of familiarity and the same themes and the same challenges coming round. So obviously the almshouse is in Bermondsey, so more kind of old industrial area towards the docks, and this development then paid for the purchase of the site and the building of the almshouse, with a contribution from the charity to deliver a kind of a durable quality of materials and a kind of quality of layout. So I suppose these two projects, which are causally connected, one paid for the other, stand for fundamentally different ideas of the city. In the clusters of glass towers, the city is something that you look out on from behind a moat of water. And the residents, of course, can afford to be selective in their interactions with the neighbourhood. In an almshouse, the city is buffered by a courtyard garden. The residents are in a supported community of mutual help, but are reliant on local services. So what transformed this project from a property transaction between a developer and a social landlord was the vision and experience of the user client, United St Saviour's, who operate Hopton's almshouses here, and they understand their residents deeply and personally. Their brief to us for a contemporary almshouse had this sort of fantastic, ambitious quality. It's underpinned by research on housing for an ageing population, fleshed out by the charity with vivid individual touches which emphasise the importance of birdsong, contact with the seasons, openness to children and grandchildren. Not a silo. We developed this evidence base further and primed our imaginations by working with social historian Ken Walpole and the photographer Philip Ebeling. Ken emphasised the conventions of withdrawal and retreat that underpin most models of housing for older people, and he urged us to resist and to make this almshouse connected and youthful. Philip visited residents at Hopton's and got out and about in Bermondsey and painted a vivid portrait of almshouse residents, carrying on working and contributing to the community, making a fresh start, passing on skills and hard-earned wisdom, and of older residents as caregivers just as much as care receivers. We were particularly struck by a study by Age UK which linked isolation and loneliness to ill health and premature death. And we found inspiration in the German innovation of multi-generational living. The board said to us, we operate an almshouse and an apartment building. We know the difference and we want an almshouse. So our design is a response to this idea of an almshouse, this thing that is typical and recognisable, but has in fact evolved a lot over the centuries. From a focus on the afterlife, these sort of almost like church-like structures where you have the bed and then you have the altar, and you sort of look upwards, hopefully for either cure or salvation, to the here and now, from charity to mutuality. A lot of our work is transformation of existing buildings, and here it was more transformational idea, adding another iteration to this sort of open-ended sequence. We digested the tradition and the many constraints of the site in this simple diagram, 2 superimposed U-plans of apartments around a small central courtyard, framing shared rooms on the street front and a roof garden to the rear. Courtyards and galleries are more or less constant in the historic variations of the almshouse. So we reinterpreted this typological framework, but it's also found in the old tenement buildings, the old inns along Borough High Street. They were keen on, the charity were keen on this being a Bermondsey building, a building with its kind of with local roots. So in that sense, these intimate wood framed courtyards were a kind of validation of a direction of travel that we were pursuing. We imagined the everyday social encounters and the spaces that might support an active individual and communal life here, with access galleries wrapping around the narrow courtyard, generously dimensioned and glazed like shared winter gardens on the doorstep of every apartment, looking across the courtyard to the shared roof garden. Sound familiar at all? With a long, relatively narrow courtyard, 40 metres by 8, where the galleries on the distant short sides look across at each other, and on the close together long sides they're offset in height, so don't overlook. Shaping an intimate garden with a large collective room to its side. A sort of generous shared hall, 2 stories high with daylight on its long edges. By flipping the gallery on the street side on the left, the garden room gets more daylight and openness to the garden to the south and gains a more intimate set of spaces to the street. That thing that looks a bit like a bar of soap is me drawing a bus, which you should remember because it's actually a sort of part of how the space plays out. And I suppose the tram in Peckham the tram's never coming, but the buses kind of are, I suppose this kind of connection to the street has become quite an important and even unexpected activator of communal life. So large glazed bays, slightly, and it's slightly elevated. You see the ramp and steps because it's at the edge of the floodplain. So the ground floor is about 800 millimetres above the street. And then this is then the garden room, and then a series of communal and shared rooms for residents, but also for the community groups that the charity supports. So the almshouse is a mixture of introvert and extrovert, robust but porous. Sat on a gentle bend in the road, a meandering medieval lane, we presume along the edge of the floodplain. And the brick volume folds in against the curve and adjusts to welcome. And the glazed gallery pushes out to kind of meet and encounter passers-by on foot and on the bus. And when Martin Craddock joined as CEO, after we got planning consent, he picked up on the idea of the ground floor and the ground floor kitchen here next to the garden room, and ran with it. And knowing how food is culture and health and skill and an occasion for sharing, he proposed making what had previously been imagined as a catering kitchen, serving meals to care receivers, to turn that into a cookery school for exchange of skills and sharing of food cultures, with 8 cooking stations. So we tailored and tuned the almshouse to the geometry of the site and to the scale of the neighbours, with these sort of 5-storey post-war slabs on the left to the north, and then these 2-storey workers' cottages to the south on the right. Hence the step down, but also obviously the sun. The tailoring and grounding in the site resulted in a nice variation and individuation of the flats, with wider, shallower flats on the north side and narrower, deeper ones on the side streets and at the back. And a lot of, not quite one-off details, but a fair amount of focus and tailoring. The galleries bind the individual flats into a connected whole, with the garden room and courtyard on the ground floor, bottom left, a small lounge and several skilled rooms on the first floor above it, and then the rooftop garden on the second floor, bottom right. So it's a sort of loop that keeps unfolding, keeps evolving. Its robust, grounded quality, its directness in relation to the street, give the almshouse a presence that is civic and long-term. It sits on Southwark Park Road, side by side with shops and a school and a marketplace a few hundred metres down the road, offering residents both visibility and connection. The protective outer shell of brick has a softness through its folds and projecting and inset bays. The softness of clay, and engages with the street with this 2-storey glazed timber bay enfolding the bus stop. One of the hardest things I think we've done is just like, how do you build right next to a bus stop? It's about there, and I think we just sort of worked it and changed and did a bunch of options, and then we stopped with the least worst one because they didn't feel like there was a right answer, but it seems to work. On the inside, it softens and opens up more with the glazed galleries like a curtain wall in oak frames, shaded from solar gain and shedding water away from the wood in very Japanese manner, or as I saw subsequently, with deep projecting steel sills, with then these mature ginkgos breaking the horizons, and ferns and water channel around their roots. And by the communal roof terrace, divided up into smaller rooms by a series of raised beds, planted with fruit and vegetables for the common table. The apartments vary from 56 square metre one-bed flats to 72 square metre two-bed accessible units on the corners. They are 100% social rent. The glazed galleries get abundant sunlight. They collect the heat in winter and vents in summer. Also, they vent in summer. And they are generously wide, with kitchen windows looking out onto them and a bench outside each flat. They serve as a first scale of informal sociability. So there isn't just a single communal space, but multiple different corners. The roof terrace has a couple of keen gardeners, but many more enthusiastic sunbathers. At the cookery school, on the ground floor, residents compete with their jollof rice. Others participate by washing up. All can learn skills and share knowledge with each other and with younger generations, and all can get into new and healthier habits, making a fresh start with mutual support. The garden room is used by residents for Zumba and patchwork and jigsaws and dinners, and is open to the wider community for baby and toddler sessions. It's been used by a primary school for an art class and for performances. And when the bus stops and people are working out, the people on the upper deck can join in. So this is social housing, where the social is not just a distant source of funding or a vague promise, but it speaks of a connected community of mutual support in the heart of the city. In terms of numbers, what United St Saviour's have done is look at holistic solutions. By making older people's housing, social housing, aspirational, they have achieved what the bedroom tax didn't. 63 bedrooms here, releasing 118 bedrooms in council housing and other almshouses across the borough. In terms of health, the proposition here is mutual care. Grandparents looking after grandchildren after school, the younger old keeping an eye out for the older old. The saying goes that it takes a village to raise a child. Well, for some it takes a city to enable dignified, active and joyful later years. A city not of atomised individuals in their separate glass towers, but an interconnected, intimate city of streets and public transport, of shared services and different generations, a city where we're not alone. To conclude, Alvaro Caesar was not wrong to say that there's much satisfaction in overcoming the obstacles. As he says, when work takes 15 years and despite difficulties and incomprehension becomes a reality, then instead of distancing us from it, our gratitude prevails over our discomfort. And I suppose by making this sort of narrative from Peckham to the almshouse with, I hope, fairly obvious parallels and the risk of showing ourselves to be one-trick ponies, there's a sense of rehearsal, repetition, the unbuilt as a half-cooked iteration that each time you get a chance to take it on and take it a little step further. And then there's an awful lot of research and dialogue that's supposed to get a place at the table, and then to actually turn that into a building that doesn't fall apart, that doesn't disappoint. In the half a lifetime since Stephen, Chris and I arrived here in London, the city's gained 1 million inhabitants, attracted an additional, 10 million visitors a year. Billions have been invested in its public transport, to the tangible effect of just about keeping the city moving. Land values have increased fourfold in real terms over that relatively short period. And as I said, while 300,000 below market rents homes have been built, about the same number have been sold off by right to buy. So the speed and trajectory of the city have accelerated and veered off. We have, for some inexplicable reason, remained stubbornly, perversely, and largely self-defeatingly attached to another idea of the city, although that's not really a great, not building is not a particular source of pride. This other city, though, pieced together in our imaginations from realities that we've observed, retains, we believe, its relevance, even if the constraints which shaped those realities bear little resemblance to the forces that shape our cities today. But it's still not entirely obvious why it's so hard, why there's so much attrition. Some of this is inherent to our collective life. I suppose it's the political drifts and lurches, the economic cycles and shocks, institutions forming and dissolving. It feels like there's it may be the slightly is it the partisan nature of our politics? Is it the short-term nature of our investment cycles that make everything a kind of strangely brittle? I took this from a passage from a fantastic book about 18th and 19th century Porto by Anigunta Nonel, who was the leader of the brigade that did the Busa housing with Alvaro Caesar, and talking about the brutal interruption of major public works, the accelerated sale of vacant land and Crown assets, difficulties encountered by successive governments in resuming public infrastructure projects for the country's modernisation, in a climate of great political turmoil, significant financial difficulties. That's how cities are made, I guess, is the long and the short of it, although I think there are better ways of doing it. This is frustrating. These kind of the volatility of any particular cycle, let alone multiple cycles overlaid on each other. But the dream of the future city, this shiny, smooth, green, you know, with a sort of where you get from A to B very quickly, but it's also green and clean and people walk about in happy couples. This is a Trojan horse. And my feeling, my reflection on having had a ringside seat at the Olympic Park and at the Elephant Castle is that this sort of dreams of the future city are, they last as long as it takes to knock it all down and start again, and then it's whatever works on the spreadsheet. And I think we have to then therefore resist, not change, but resist this tabula rasa, wiping the slate clean and starting again. Time is one of the factors that makes design in cities distinctive, and there are, not every awkward inheritance is ideal or is workable, but there are many awkward inheritances that we can work with to indeed, as Caesar says, make a result that is not fragile. I'll finish with this passage from an essay I wrote about trying to process this waking dream of practice, where actually there's no reality that mysteriously I can share insights about. It's a series of the city is made through a series of competing fictions, and actually what we have to do is contest the city in our imagination and find allies to help us carry this contest into reality. So if we can't reshape the city to match our dreams with this sort of pure and smooth, ageless and timeless, shouldn't we change our dreams to accommodate the city as we find it? Dirty and congested, ruined and under construction, in this restless state of becoming. This requires a rewiring of our professional imaginations and rejection of the fiction of architectural control. It requires us to dissolve our egos and the collective imagination of the city, to find our creativity alongside interpretive or improvised skills, working as editors, archaeologists, musicians, working with the resistances of the city's fabric to enable us to build on rather than erase existing capacities, leveraging the impacts of individual imagination, reinforcing the responsibility that comes with exercising the imagination. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Hi, William. So I have a question about poetic resonance and the kind of felt experience of the everyday. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe talk about the kind of role of metaphor, analogy, material and spatial kind of thematics in your thinking. Thanks.
Perhaps if I just talk about not even method, just sort of drawing. And something that I find is that I think we draw with our bodies, certainly hand drawing. And even if there's something about the resistance, but there's something about scale. Anyway, I find drawing incredibly triggering, and I suppose maybe there's this thing where that's the discipline that one starts to learn, because when we were working on the Olympic Park, I remember drawing and actually sort of, when we had about 10 years of photographs of the Fridge Mountain, the railway sidings of Thornton's Fields, the big breakfast house at Old Ford Locks, this and that, and just sort of this jumble of recollections, and somehow the drawing this, it was a little bit the same with the Upper Lee Valley landscape strategy, there's something about drawing the city became a way of, I suppose, stirring the memories or even the reading of the place. It's like you draw the Hackney Cut and you think, that's not a meander, that's engineered. When did they build that? You know, and then they cut it in the 1760s. Because of course, if they'd done it in the 1820s or something, they'd have done a straight line, or I don't know, you know. And you sort of start to feel these things just by drawing them. I remember sort of seeing that, just like, and we built this drawing up layer by layer of, because actually at Olympic site you've got, I think, 12-metre level difference between the lowest level of the old meandering river, the canal is above that, and then you've got a land bridge that goes over. And I was thinking, where, you know, other than Suicide's Bridge and Archway, you know, London isn't really a vertical city, but if you go down the foreshore, suddenly it feels vertical. And it reminded me of the place where my parents lived on the edge of the new town in Edinburgh with the Water of Leith, carving through this sort of valley with these kind of urban areas above, but just this sort of chasm below. So I think there is a kind of process where drawing prompts a kind of reflections of logic. So this idea that it's all feelings and intuition. Actually, sort of, I think you'll, if you train your drawing, you can make design propositional. I always say talk to yourself while you're drawing, because actually otherwise, you know, you can get lost. You need to sort of say, no, follow that thought, or actually, no, actually, drift off. You have permission, do that. And then, so it's triggering memories, it's finding an analysis that you're actually understanding the logic of something that at face value doesn't seem to have a logic. And then you kind of, and then I think there's an aspect of drawing something in perspective, which is like imagining you're there. So perspective is very important to how we work. And I suppose there's when you're drawing a perspective, well, you can draw a room, box, single, 1 point perspective, whatever. Of course, the moment it becomes interesting is the moment you have something that already exists. And maybe it's sort of jarring to your idea of what something you've got in mind, but you know, in a way, that bit of reality for me, for each of these drawings, is a really key thing, because that's the bit you're sort of holding on to. The sort of fantasy or the real estate brochure or whatever, that's the disease. And this thing that's just there and that's accidental and that somehow has sort of come through all these economic and political cycles, and it's been built, which, you know, is a sort of minor miracle, and then it's also endured, it hasn't been knocked down. These are things that, for me, are kind of seem to be a kind of valid and important kind of touchstone for the imagination that respects things that are there and doesn't try to tidy and clean everything up, but that has a curiosity and interest in ordinary life and things that have survived whatever processes are tidying, to create something, a kind of condition of intimacy in the city. Because I suppose, you know, the healthy, hygienic city where you don't overlook and you have a you know, good sunlight, you've got abundant green space if your taxes can pay to keep it up. That's great, but actually one of the things with the art, which was particularly there with the Arms House, is this sort of sense that isolation is also not helpful. And so this sort of sense as to how, and I suppose we were, you know, studying and going through this, you know, I have dim recollections of the 70s sort of welfare state and this thing that was dismantled throughout the 80s. And so maybe that's just sort of part of the DNA of trying to stubbornly hold on to some idea that hasn't entirely gone, and doing that. And I don't know if this works. I mean, it's certainly not a magic formula, by holding on to things that are actually there in front of you.
Yeah, I think that was kind of really beautiful. But I suppose I was sort of approaching the question from the perspective of a kind of context and the reading of kind of architecture through its contexts and the kind of context within context, in the way an artist would look at a bed or a kind of kitchen thing of hunger, and the way that that can be kind of extrapolated out into the social world and the framework that maybe architecture can respond to and build around it.
I suppose, context is this something that comes out of literary theory in the 80s, translating the Italian ambiente, which comes out of the 60s, or even was it Ernesto Rogers in the 60s, or Gustavo Giovannoni in the 1920s, which is an idea of a kind of, and there's a lot of organicist thought in Italian urbanistic culture, and I suppose that is a sense that nothing lives in isolation, everything's part of a condition. I mean, where shall I take this one? I suppose it's maybe there is a way of looking at the accumulation of compost, stuff, soil, actually the remarkable fertility of London's soil. The accumulations, if you look at Ebbsfleet or whatever other kind of new towns, they're so hard and slow to get off the ground. So I think understanding the network and the multiple scales of which any building or project is a part is utterly fundamental to realising a plausible building of social benefit. Because what can you and do you need to do on site, and what can you rely on, and actually what shouldn't you kind of be replacing? So I suppose there's this, in that sense, in a way the whole working at urban scale, so probably for us, it's a bit of a mug's game, and certainly when the GLA and the Architecture and Urbanism Unit actually had a bit of opportunity, even then it wasn't easy, and then without that it's really hard, but nonetheless it's this thing you can't let go of, because otherwise you're just left with these isolated frameworks, just thinking, well, how do I fulfil the brief on this site? So I suppose our conversations with a lot of clients, I suppose I emphasise the thing about allies. So it's like, we're not islands, we're not on our own. We have to talk about it, so as we talk to ourselves in the room, we also actually have lengthy conversations, what I like to call pre-design, where you don't think you've got an answer until you know what the question is. When we started doing urban design, I remember there was one project where I was quite chuffed to get it, and I remember sort of going into these rooms of people, and they were all expecting to have an answer on day one, and you only just had a little bit of dipped your toe in the side. So we developed some sort of stalling tactics, and that's not about laziness or about not having done the homework. It's about actually realising that there's one that I think was a sort of second or third urban design project we did, where I went in with these sort of drawings to the first meeting of an idea, and they weren't daft. There were some interesting ideas and all of that, but we ended up kind of pursuing some of those ideas, but putting them on the table before you know who you're talking to, where they're coming from, what their concerns are, is ridiculous. And of course we got hammered, and probably rightly so, and we learned a lesson, which is that so actually not showing designs, because people want to know, they're in a big hurry to know, what does it look like? And not showing people designs is kind of slightly it's frustrating for them, it's slightly self-defeating, but actually that whole pre-design work is super important, and I think we've probably developed it. I wouldn't say to an art form, but we'll try to get better at it or less bad at it, just because it's really important to actually hear people before you speak over them, or actually ideally don't speak over them, but they actually give them, rather than saying here's my idea to this thing that you've barely formulated, and we haven't really interrogated. You try and do it in a way that tease out their thoughts, their ideas, their ambitions, their sort of courage for these things, their anxieties, before you've sort of tried to table an answer, and out of that, their imagination. So I suppose I think what I'm talking about partly is with this thing with allies. It's this sort of drinking this stuff in, understanding what energies you can actually tap into, learning who your allies are and how you can unlock their ambitions through your spatial actions. And then, I don't know, at that point, design becomes this thing where, I find with a lot of these projects now, we're doing these ridiculously complex projects with a lot of constraints, and a lot of it you have to play the card game quite carefully, but you don't have to sort of compose or think very hard about the design. You're almost like testing out sort of some permutations and ideas. It's never diagrammatic, it's always experiential, and I think there's a way of, what I'm sort of describing is a way, and I don't have a name for it, but it's just that you sort of tease out the possibilities, you tease out what the limits and constraints are, and then that's the moment that you're able to actually design quite freely, quite intuitively, quite logically, and that if you try and force it, actually it sort of probably makes it more fragile.
Thank you.
William, firstly, on the issue of this type of drawing, which is, I kind of associate with the kind of birth of your practice and kind of the newcomers to London and kind of understanding it, it's urban grain, but also the infrastructure and water and that kind of lovely valley. And in these drawings, you've always been, the value of them is selective in what you include and what you don't. And the kind of modern tool for us is kind of Google Maps, satellite view, kind of tilted, where you can't, you can understand a lot, if you want to draw it up and go into street view and things. So, one question is this type of drawing still done? Do you have the time to do it? And how has it changed from 30 years ago to now? That's the first question. And actually, that'll be the one question. I just want to mention, actually, that I hate the name Apple and Blue. It's a kind of, what a project, what a client to be able to do an arms house. And I could just feel the warmth in the room, kind of, and the optimism going up the further you got, showing these beautiful people cooking together, jollof rice and something. Wow, that's the dream. Yeah. That's optimism. You won. Yeah. But for me, I've been in the city all my life, and I see it get worse and worse. I see that. I'm trying to think, can that project, where, it was just so amazing to meet the residents there. I've never seen people so happy with new housing provision. And it feels like that was a moment in time, a very special client, a bung of money from a big capitalist development. But what I thought was amazing there, and hasn't really been talked about, is the kind of craft of your practice, the kind of details that feel like they should only exist in Cambridge, not social housing in Southwark, And I just think that is another part of the work maybe not talked about today, is that kind of passion for tectonic, for construction, for layeredness, for robustness as well. So I'm going to go back to the question.
Well, I suppose...
What is this drawing do now?
I like to do a one-to-one detail for pretty much every project, because your body knows how big things are. Drawing things that don't fall apart, imagining, like I say, that you can have this sort of social imagination, but at a certain point, your imagination becomes about building physics. And those turn-coated stainless steel shelves at the arms house with this sort of oak frame curtain wall. You know, there's this that sort of and obviously it's not there on that first sketch, and then it sort of emerges, and I suppose it's this thing of you're kind of exploring how do you build. That's a cantilever off on a shock connection, thermally broken, with then some steel and carpentry brackets, and then this sort of these stainless steel shelves that then folded up around, certainly on certain corners for weathering, so I suppose stooling and things like that. And I suppose my basic take on a lot of this is that I suppose the easier a building is to assemble, probably the easier it is to dismantle. And obviously you don't want to make something that's perversely difficult to make, but three-dimensional modelling to deal with rain, obviously the angle there to sort of mostly keep pigeons off, all these things, and then the depth of it to deal with solar shading as well as runoff. All of those are things that you're sort of doing on a detail. So I think that whole world of building physics, it'd be great to be able to deal with it scientifically, but I think in a way you're always dealing with things that are one-offs, or there's a lot of one-offs where you just need to gather the experience, bring it to the table, keep doing it better. So that's a lot of the drawings we do now. I think we probably do less pretty drawings now, although not. I mean, actually we did a bit of one for a village project for an open opera group. So we've been doing more work, competing for work in Belgium recently, and I suppose it's this weird thing where CGIs, people are starting to reach saturation point. So we did a competition in Marymont in the south of Belgium, where we did, I think we did 12 hand-drawn perspectives in a weekend, and one of them is this Bruegel-like perspective over the whole thing. So it's not quite, but it's sort of, it's getting on. It doesn't have Mons or La Louvière in it, but it does have the slag heaps. So it's got this sort of landscape garden with a viewing tower from the top of an old water tower, and then this sort of brutalist museum, this woodland, this vegetable garden, which is at the heart of the old estate, the slag heaps on the horizon. So I suppose there's always this thing of just trying to wrap in large bits of reality, and even, sort of people people taking selfies on the viewing platform, and the kids group growing in. So I suppose, and that's, Tarkovsky writes beautifully about Bruegel and Carpaccio, and so it was through Tarkovsky that I got into Bruegel and Carpaccio, aged sort of 19 or something, and so started drinking these things in. And even, was at the beginning of Andrei Rublev, where there's the pigskin balloon floating over the, a kind of totally anachronistic scene, starting off with a close-up of a tower of an Orthodox church and then floating over the landscape. So that kind of stuff's constantly sort of in there, part of the kind of imaginative memory, and I'm kind of hoping that, I keep on hoping that there'll be a turning of the tide, and that hand drawing will be valued, and that we'll win a competition doing hand drawings. These last ones were two brave ones where we actually did it all by hand, so we shall see. And one of them we definitely didn't get, but it's a sort of hope that you can actually talk to the emotions, talk to the imagination, rather than just like, and when you do it photorealistic, people go, what's that bit made of? What have you done? It's like people become very literal, and so I suppose the proposition we're tentatively re-exploring is the idea that you could do drawings like this and actually sort of say, it's your job to complete the other half of this drawing in your head. Just as it's your job to help us complete the other half of the scheme. And that anyone who wants it on the plate isn't the person that we can work well with.